Edda held the last crust between two fingers when Marta stepped into the doorway and said, "Please." Share it. Shame tightened Edda's throat before she even looked at the child at her feet. Her hands moved with practice. She folded the shawl, rubbed the bowl's rim, and set the crust down beside the child's palm. The doorway smelled of damp straw and chimney soot. The problem was simple and immediate. There was only enough for one small meal, and Marta stood there with a thin shawl and a small boy who trembled from the cold. Edda's shame pushed her first. She counted portions by thumb against the wooden bowl. She had learned to hide hunger behind practical gestures. Marta's face stayed level. Jacob held close to Marta's skirts and did not speak. The village had not spoken openly of the mill for 2 days, but talk moved from door to door before dawn. A whispered report arrived with Marta, and the whispered report was a new kind of pressure reader. "Marta, the larder is nearly bare." Marta's voice did not plead. It delivered fact. Edda kept her eyes on the bowl. She could feel her pulse at the base of her neck. Shame shifted into suspicion as she remembered the mill's shutters closed and Hrolf's slow gait 2 days ago. The immediate choice sat like a stone on the threshold: feed her own children or give the last bit to a neighbor. Edda placed the crust in Jacob's small hand and stepped back. "Jacob," she said, "eat what you can now." The child chewed with small noises. Marta's mouth tightened. Edda's suspicion moved into action. She had been a watchful mother since the winter began. She had kept a tied cloth pouch of barley and a wooden feeding bowl by the hearth. The house smelled of barley husks and boiled roots. The smell was a record of decisions already made. By the time the lane filled with low light, murmurs had gathered into a pattern. Friends and distant kin checked one another's doorsteps. Edda moved toward the longhouse, because the village moved in one slow current. At the lane she found Marta speaking again, this time to 3 others. Hrolf stood with his arms folded. His coat looked patched at the elbow and his fingers had the knobby joints of a man who had hefted sacks. "For years the miller has not come. Martano wheel this morning. No sacks at the larder. I went after light, and the store is empty." Jacob clutched Marta's hand and wept once, thin and sharp. When the crowd heard that, the current sharpened. Inside the longhouse, a low fire made a small ring of warmth. Villagers sat on benches close to the smoke and spoke in short sentences. Edda sat with her shawl folded across her knees and watched the mouths of others. Her shame moved again, but this time it braided with fear. The fear was not for herself alone. It was the fear of being forced to choose in front of neighbors, to justify portions by weight, and to watch children with sunken cheeks. Fear tightened conversation and sent Hrolf to speak up. Hrolf stood, letting the chair scrape. "You can forage the marsh for reeds and roots." He said. "He can take a small party. Or we can go to the miller's house and ask him if grain is hidden." His voice carried the rough authority of habit. Several heads turned. Marta touched Jacob's shoulder and looked at Edda. Edda felt the discussion press against the edges of her shyness, and into refusal. "Have no time for questions." An older woman said, "If grain is at the mill, hiding it will starve us all. If we raid and find it, we will divide. If we do nothing, children will empty." The words landed like stones. Arguments moved fast. One villager described sacks seen moved at night near the mill. Others shook their heads. A man called Kjell leaned forward. "Who saw sacks? Who saw them moved?" he asked, voice high with something between impatience and fear. The accusing villager, a broad-faced woman with a red nose, answered quickly. "Saw a shadow by the mill last week. Sacks were fewer when I passed by in the morning." Eyes flicked to Hrolf. Hrolf answered, calm but blunt, "We will search. We will not take without word. First we find facts." That decision pushed Edda into a new emotional turn. Suspicion widened into anger toward the idea that one household might hide food. The council sent 3 to the marsh and 2 to the mill, and the rest stayed to ration what remained. Edda's hands worked on portions while she listened. She cut meager slices of root bread and pressed a small amount of barley into a pot. She watched the children whose cheeks had hollows deepen with each delay. Conversation kept returning to two options: public shame if hoarding was uncovered, or private theft if no one acted, and her children went hungry. At noon, the Marsh party left with narrow shoulders under cloaks and crude forks for pulling reeds. Edda did not join them at first. Her duty was at home. She watched as Hrolf and two others slipped into a thinning fog. He called back softly, "Edda, come if you can spare a hand later." "We may need more hands to dig," she nodded and chose to wait until dusk. Her shame and her resolve bumped against each other. Shame asked privacy, resolve asked risk. In the late afternoon, a single loud sound broke the low routine. A child shrieked on the lane. Voices rose. Edda moved outside and found Jacob clutching his arm. A scab had been ripped. The boy had fallen near a frozen puddle. The fall added another urgency. Marta's jaw hardened and she said, "Jacob cannot go to the marsh tonight if his arm stays like this. We need the mill." The practical demand sharpened Edda's resolve. She wrapped Jacob's arm with a clean strip and prepared to move with Hrolf. The party for the mill was smaller than it could have been. Hrolf took Edda and two others, a lantern-bearer named Soren and the accusing villager, whom Edda learned was called Anja. They left under low sky and carried quiet in the way people carry weight. Conversation had become business instead of rumor. Edda's shame had been replaced by a new root: protective determination. She spoke little and kept her hands steady on the sack straps she had borrowed. They crossed the lane that led to the mill with a careful step. The mill's wheel sat still as a stone. Moonlight painted the water low and glassy. The miller's door showed no fresh tracks. Soren crouched and whispered, "There are prints here. Many prints, but recent ones head to the shed." Hrolf nodded and pushed the shed door. It gave with a splintering sound. The smell of dry grain came out like a held breath. Inside the shed they found sacks stacked along the wall. Edda's chest tightened. Anja hissed, "Here they are, see. Here they kept food while we starved." Hands moved without ceremony. Hrolf lifted a sack seam and pulled out a handful of grain. Jacob's small eyes flashed in Edda's memory and her hands moved again, this time driven by a new, sharp emotion. A fierce protective urge that ran against the public law of property. Hrolf looked at Edda. He did not need to speak. She felt the choice in the set of his jaw and the tilt of his head. The accusation that had risen in the longhouse now met the quiet fact of grain. Edda's shame sharpened into guilt at first for thinking of stealing, then into a colder calculation. If the miller had kept sacks away, many would die. If they exposed him, villages must hunger on until winter thinned. If they took grain quietly, they would face accusation but also put warm food into mouths that would otherwise freeze. Soren placed his lantern on the floor. The light trembled on sacking. Anja's hands shook. "Hrolf, we must decide quickly. One bag will feed many if shared. One bag taken quietly may spare our children tonight." His voice held the hard weight of community. Edda knew then that a choice made in the dark would stain names, and that stains could stay longer than hunger. Edda reached for a sack and felt the coarse weave under her palms. She thought of her own child's sleeping breaths at home. She thought of Marta's pulled mouth when the child had cried. She thought of Jacob's fall. Her body moved before her words. She set the seam open, slipped grain into a cloth, and tied it at her belt. Her action turned the conversation into a new strain of sound. Anja swore softly. Soren looked at Hrolf as if needing instruction. Hrolf did not stop her. He bent and took a second handful himself. When they stepped back from the shed, the night held a small, private thunder. Footsteps muffled on the path. No shout rose. No one had struck them. They walked with sacks held low and faces narrow with contained fear. Edda's hands ached at the weight. Her heart hammered not from exertion but from exposure to a choice that would mark her publicly if revealed. On returning, they split the grain into small portions. Edda gave a good share to her children and wrapped a thin parcel for Marta and Jacob. Word spread quickly. Some thanked softly. Some looked away. A whisper went through the lane. Grain had been distributed from the mill. Accusations came in the form of stony faces at the doorway. Anja refused to hide her anger and spoke the name that cut. The miller kept sacks. You knew. You took. Who gave you that right? Hrolf answered in a voice that did not spare him either. He saw the sacks. We decided as a group. Some of us took to keep children alive. The group broke into a short exchange. Edda heard her name said in a dozen ways. She did not defend herself at length. She handed bowls and watched how people ate the porridge with quick, hungry motions. The scene became a ledger of small mercies and small resentments. A neighbor named Sign approached Edda and spoke low. Your hand trembles. Did you take more? Edda looked at Sign and then at the empty hearth. She answered simply, no more than needed. Sign's eyes did not soften. The accusation became rumor. Rumor turned toward the miller. In the longhouse, voices rose and leveled again into decisions about fairness. The fracture widened into a quiet, dividing line. That night, Edda sat by her window with a small handful of grain at the sill. The children slept with mouths too small to fill. Marta came once, bent, and left a scrap of stew for a neighbor in return. Hrolf visited with a slow, unreadable look and said, We cannot admit theft, but neither can we watch them starve. We will speak when it is safe. He did not define safe. His words introduced a new tension, practical mercy versus public justice. During the night someone knocked at Edda's door. She opened to find the miller pale and shrunken. He held a scrap of paper and an old ledger. His voice quivered as he said, I kept seed for spring. I meant no harm. My family is small. I thought. Edda stepped back. The miller stared at his boots, as if the dirt could explain anything. The miller's presence created a second twist. It changed the suspect into a fragile human before them. Marta spoke before Edda could move. You should have said so, Miller. We would have divided seed and set aside for spring. We would have taken less and lived. The miller looked up. Eyes wet. He feared the sacks would be gone if I left them in the larder. I hid some to save seed for my wife's labor come spring. His admission reframed the allegation. The twist made two things true at once. The miller acted from private fear, and private fear had consequences for the many. Arguments flared into a short, sharp exchange. Hrolf pressed. You should have spoken to the council. The miller answered. If I had, folk would have taken seed for planting, not for bread. Seed is not the same as grain for porridge, Soren added. But children needed porridge. Now the room spun into quick back and forth lines. Edda kept silent and watched hands tighten on bowls. Conversation clipped like a blade. Anja demanded a public reckoning. If you took, you must answer. She said if the miller hid, he must be punished. Hrolf's jaw set. He looked at Edda in a way that asked for steadiness. Edda felt a slow burn along her spine. Shame returned, braided with a new emotional turn. Resolve that would not justify theft with words but would protect the living. She stood and faced the room. Have soup in pots and hands to carry. I have children who wake with emptiness. If we call for punishment now, tonight families will go without and the miller may lose seed he needs to plant. We must temper law with need. Her voice was plain. People blinked. Her words set off a rapid exchange of short lines. We cannot be lawless. One said he cannot watch children starve. Another replied. The argument moved fast and sharp with 3 to 6 quick returns. Hrolf made the decision then. Slow and final. Will return what we can when spring comes. We will ask the miller to show seed and account. For now we share and we watch each other closely. That compromise shifted the group's mood. Some nodded, some turned away. The fracture did not heal, but the immediate hunger eased. Edda closed her hand around the wooden bowl and felt the weight of small decisions. At dawn, Edda placed a measured handful of grain on the windowsill for the children. She smoothed the cloth of her shawl and tested the pots for warmth. Outside, voices carried, some thankful, some accusing. Marta stopped and touched Edda's shoulder. Briefly. I did what you believed. Marta, voice low. Jacob peered at the grain and then at Edda and said nothing. Edda answered by lifting the bowl and moving back inside. The final moment arrived like a single breath. A neighbor's foot struck a stone outside and the sound was blunt. Edda opened the small door and saw Hrolf and the miller standing together at the lane. The miller had returned a small sack and a list. He met Edda's eyes and nodded once. "Hrolf, we will account and we will watch. For now, keep your children fed." Edda accepted the nod and let her hands move to the child's hair. Shame had shaped Edda's first move. Suspicion followed rumor. Fear drove action. Protective resolve pushed her to risk a private theft that would not stay private. The emotional turns left marks on the village. Thank you notes, angry stares, a patched ledger, and a handful of grain on a sill. Edda pushed between the low posts and smelled the metal tang of old stew before she saw the pot itself. She grabbed the ladle and found the bottom of the communal pottage scraped clean. Suspicion tightened her fingers around the handle. She read the new ration list nailed to the post, and the shortfall was written in blunt lines. "There's not enough," she said. The pot clinked. A child at her feet began to moan. She remembered the crust she had held with 2 fingers the week before. The memory was exact, Marta's small palm under the bread, the way Edda folded her shawl, the shame settling behind her jaw. That earlier sharing had left a quiet rule in her hands: always check before you take. The village depended on those rules now. Dawn leaned low over the longhouse roof. Edda stepped into the courtyard with the ladle. Marek moved at her side without asking. Marek's boots left soft prints in the dark mud. He did not speak first. His mouth was set in the way that meant he had already counted possibilities. Someone had nailed a ration list to the post with rough thumbtacks. Edda read the names aloud. Marek's face shifted the fraction of a degree that said he felt the same tension. The problem was concrete. The pot was nearly empty, and the list shortened everyone's share. The stakes were immediate. Children would go without unless someone reshaped the measure. Thomas stood by the hearth, sleeves rolled, a wooden platter under his arm. His eyes stayed on the pot, but his jaw worked. "He cut this down from yesterday. He said orders from the steward. Everyone gets less." He kept his voice flat. Edda felt suspicion turn to restrained anger. Widow Enya pushed forward in the line. Her fingers curled around the rim of the serving bowl, as if she might steady herself. "Me children are small. Thomas?" She said they need warm porridge. Now her voice shook but did not break. Thomas set the bowl down by a quern tablet. "List is the list," he said. "You know how it goes." He tapped the nail marks with a thumb. The exchange snapped like a brittle twig. An argument rose without ceremony. Thomas names from the list and refused extras. Enya pleaded. Edda felt the urge to speak before she measured the consequences. She stepped into the line. "Thomas, Edda, give her a little more. Marta is small." Enya's children are smaller. Still her tone was low. She counted portions in her head the way she always had. Giving 1 extra bowl meant less for another family tomorrow, but not giving it meant a child might faint before dusk. Thomas looked at her. "Edda, we cannot change the steward's list. If we do, they'll cut us further next week." The way he said they held a distance between him and the decision maker. "Someone takes from us." Marek, someone with a cart passed by yesterday. Sacks moved. He leaned closer. "Lord's cart, unmarked. No receipts." Thomas' jaw tightened. "Rumors swell like bad grain. We cannot act on hearsay. We have to ration to the numbers." He set the bowl back on the hearth with a hand that trembled, just enough to show restraint. Enya's small son sucked his knuckles. "Please," she said. "Please, Thomas. We have nothing at home but straw." Her voice turned on the last word like a key. The plate in Thomas' hands seemed heavier. Edda remembered the crust again. That concrete image shaped what she could not ignore. She leaned lower. "Hannah," she said to the woman nearest the cook, "would you trade me a piece of cloth for an extra bowl? My shawl will do. I will not ask more." Her voice was practical. She unfastened the corner of her wool shawl and held it out. The woven edge was thin from years of wear. Hannah took the cloth and set it on the hearth beside the bowl. She glanced at the ration list, and then at Thomas' own bowl. She said, "On for Marta." She slid the portion across with a flat hand. Marta ate with her thumb, bent over the bowl like an animal that had learned to make itself small. Edda watched the child's shoulders rise and fall. The immediate danger quieted, but the sense of unfairness did not leave the air. By mid-morning, Marek pulled Edda aside near a lean to where the longhouse shadowed a patch of wet ground. He lowered his voice. A cart moved through. "I tell you," he said, not the steward's tally. No marks. His breath made a white line in the cold. Edda kept her reply short. "Where did it go?" Marek tapped his chin toward the steward's shed. "I saw tracks near the green, fresh wagon ruts, not the usual carts. Someone moves grain in the dark." He nodded to a line of houses on the other side of the green. Edda felt doubt, then a sharp clarity. Doubt, could she be mistaken? Clarity, the footprints matched the stoop by the steward's storage. Her hands tightened on the bundle of cloth. She had traded who should follow them, she said. Marek agreed with a curt nod. They did not speak as they walked. The lane ran narrow and the rain had slicked the cobbles. Footprints led away from the longhouse green and toward the steward's low shed at the village edge. Enya joined them halfway, her face pale but determined. "Edie will not leave my children empty-handed," she said. She kept her voice level. She had a blade tucked into her belt, not new, but clean at the edge. The three of them reached the shed and stood with their breath clouding the locked door. The wood smelled of damp straw and old barley. Edda tested the lock with her fingertips. It resisted the first pull. Thomas arrived at the gate then, hands empty. He held his position with a stance that signaled caution. "Thomas, Marek, did you see a cart?" Thomas' eyes slid to the tracks, then to the shed. He looked away. "I know nothing about carts. I keep the pots. I do not see what the steward does." His voice sounded rehearsed. Edda struck the lock with the flat of her hand and felt the timber give with a dry sound. The latch gave. Inside, sacks lay stacked against the back wall. The smell of grain rose, warm and buried. The sacks were tied and labeled in the steward's hand. Edda reached in and touched a sack. It yielded under her fingers. She pulled at the coarse twine and felt the weight of a hand's decision press against her throat. Behind her, someone drew breath. Thomas stepped forward then and said, "You should not." The sentence broke when Marek lifted a sack, and the coarse cloth whispered. Marek did not hide the fact that he meant to carry one out. Enya's hand moved toward the nearest tie. A sharp confrontation opened in the lane then. Voices rose in quick exchange. "Thomas, a day did you nail that ration list?" "No, Thomasy posted what I was told. I am the cook, not the steward." He pushed a palm out. "You will not take what is not yours." His voice was thin. He looked at the sacks as if they might breathe. "Then who told you to shrink the bowls?" "Marek." Thomas' face shifted. He glanced at the tracks on the mood. "Orders come from above. The steward counts. I follow." His hands were empty. Enya snapped, "Counted where? If the steward keeps stores hidden, then who keeps us alive?" She stepped closer, and for the first time the steadiness in her voice showed real anger. Thomas' reply came quicker. "If you storm the shed, we'll be punished. They'll take more from us if we break their law. Do you want that?" Rapid lines passed then, sharp and short. "Thomas, did you move sacks?" Marek demanded. "No." "Thomasy would not you deny it?" "Thomas, Enya, but the tracks end at your path." The cart didn't pass the steward's gate alone. Her hands tightened on her skirt. Edda stepped between them. Her voice was low, but carried. "You cannot let the children starve, because we fear a punishment none of us can afford." She looked at Thomas. "If you took some, then say so. If you did not, stand with us now by telling what you know." Her jaw set. Thomas' mouth moved without sound for a beat. Then he looked at the sacks, at the faces around him, and his shoulders dropped as if carrying an invisible weight. "I moved a few. I did not mean to hide them. I thought to keep some in case the steward cut deliveries more. I thought it would be a store to tide us." A collective breath passed through the small group. Suspicion shifted into betrayal for some and into reluctant understanding for others. Edda felt anger and relief in the same pulse. She took one steadying step backward and let the weight of that confession land. Marek's face went flat. "You kept a reserve. For whom?" he asked. Thomas looked at the ground for my mother, for my sister. I could not watch them thin out. I did not mean to take more than my share. He ran a hand over his hair, and the gesture made him look suddenly younger. He thought I could manage portions to avoid ruin. I misjudged. His voice cracked on the last word. Enya spat the next line. Then you made the choice for us. Her eyes shone with a heat that had nothing to do with the afternoon you chose, who lived, and who did not. Her words landed like rocks into still water. Edda listened to the small, quick exchanges. She felt an internal shift again, doubt into resolve. Doubt, because she had not known Thomas could do such a thing. Resolve, because the course now required action. The village would either break and lose more or make a blunt compromise. Marek put down the sack he had been lifting. He kept his hands steady. Bring these out now. He said, we divide what is here in plain sight. We post names. We watch each other take. He met Thomas' eyes and did not flinch. Thomas swallowed. If we do that, the steward may punish us for opening his shed. He keeps accounts. His breath was short. Edda, then we make a record ourselves. We call Marek and 2 others to watch. We measure with a marked bowl. We do not take without witnesses. She looked at Enya. Yado, you agree? She asked. Enya nodded. Once he do. For the children, her fingers loosened from the skirt. They carried sacks out to the green, where the longhouse faces gathered. Marek spoke plainly to the crowd. Found these sacks hidden at the shed. Thomas says he moved some. We will count and share here with witnesses. His tone left little room for argument. The villagers gathered like a low tide. Some faces read anger. Others read tired relief. Marta peered from Edda's skirt and sucked at a thumb. Edda held the child's shoulder without looking down. She watched the crowd instead. Marek set a sack into the dirt and cut the twine. Grain spilled slow and clean. The sound filled the quiet in the way a measured thing does, practical and not comforting. Thomas stood by, hands at his sides. He did not meet Enya's eyes. A small twist came as they measured. A ledger page slipped from the tied bundle of receipts. It bore the steward's ink and an added line showing transfers out on a date when the village meant to receive deliveries. The paper named a field account closer to the Lord's manor. The revelation changed the shape of guilt. It proved the steward had shifted grain from the village stores to other hands. Murmurs rose. So it was not only Thomas. Marek. Someone moved sacks higher up. He folded the paper and held it like a found thing. Thomas' face pallid. He thought it was to keep some back for us if more cuts came. He said he was ashamed to say nothing because I feared a worse cut if I made a fuss. The reason did not excuse the secrecy. The crowd sorted into practical teams. Marek and 2 other men checked measures. Edda and Enya tracked names on a scrap of wood. They wrote slowly and deliberately who took what and how much. The ledger page went into the longhouse records where Marek it would be safe. Thomas stood beside the hearth as people filed past to take measured sacks. In the dusk, the redistribution felt like an uneasy truce. Some received more than the morning had allowed. Others left with their allotted measure and a weight in their mouths. Marek spoke to the assembled headsi. We'll watch the steward's accounts now. We will trade work for grain where we must. We will not let stores leave without witnesses. His voice had the flat practicality of someone used to counting things down to the last handful. Edda took Marta home. The cottage was low and smelled of wet straw. She set a thin bowl of porridge between them and sat with her back straight. Marta took small bites and did not ask for more. Edda tore a piece of bread and set it in the child's palm without ceremony. The immediate danger had passed, but the village had changed. Lines that had been invisible trust, authority, favor now showed in the way people moved their shoulders. At night, footsteps crossed the lane. Someone knocked once, sharply, at Edda's door. She opened to find Marek holding the steward's copy of delivery notes. His face read concern rather than triumph. We will watch the steward tomorrow. He said Thomas will help us post the list each morning, so everyone sees it. He paused. He will need to keep our eyes open for carts that pass without notice. His words set a new plan in motion. Edda nodded. She folded her shawl the way she always did and set it over the back of her chair. She looked at Marta eating quietly. The chapter's arc closed on a concrete action. Marek left the ledger on Edda's table and said, "Post this on the longhouse wall at dawn. Everyone must know the knock on the door signaled not a new beginning but a decision made and a watch begun." Edda lit the low lamp and the room filled with warm, steady light as she pinned the paper to the table's edge. The chest of events from the day settled into a new arrangement, some grain measured out in public, a ledger moved into common view, a cook's confession, and a village set to keep its own count. Edda felt the residue of shame from past choices and the resolve to act differently when needed. She held Marta's small hand and said nothing. Her jaw relaxed a fraction. The final sound in the chapter was not a declaration, but a practical instruction: post the paper at dawn and stand watch together. That was the decision that would shape their next day. A rough knock splits the pre-dawn hush. A Reeves boot fills the lane and a sealed requisition is shoved under Edda's door. Suspicion tightens the inside of her chest before she lifts even one foot. She knows what a sealed notice means in a season when granaries creak and bellies make their own complaints. The Reeves voice comes low and impatient through the timber. "Open. Rations will be inspected at first light." The grain collector's leather rasped as he set the seal on the table. The paper smells faintly of damp and iron. Edda presses her hand to the wood and counts the nails with her fingertips, the way she counts portions at supper, and already the room is smaller with the knowledge of loss. Edda steps into the lane with her shawl folded around her shoulders. Her fingers bend, hold the feeding bowl at her hip. She had given away the last crust last night when Marta came to the doorway. She remembers that small shame in the child's palm, and she remembers how the bowl had felt light afterward. She remembers the hidden reserve she found scraped to the bottom of a communal pot 2 nights ago, the ration list nailed to the post, the shortfall written in blunt numbers. Those memories sit like stones in her mouth when the Reeves' eyes sweep the row of doorway cedar. Thomas says from the shadow of the longhouse, voice thin with cold deal, "Make a list. Keep your door open." He looks at her with the same tired look he has had for weeks, sunken cheeks, a scarf that smells of the same smoke as her shawl. His hands are stained with last night's ash. His eyes briefly find the shawl she folds the way a person checks a wound. The Reeve clears his throat. "Who will inspect stores?" "We answer to the steward. Who hides grain hides from the king's tax. Who hides grain risks fine and loss and jail." He pronounces the words without heat, like a man reading a practice script. The grain collector lifts the notice and reads out the names in a voice that tries for evenness and misses. People stir in their doorways, shifting weight from one foot to another. The green outside the longhouse already smacks of breath and damp. Marta comes forward, clutching a child to her chest. She holds the small body close so the boy's cheek brushes her collarbone. "Please," Marta says, staring at the review. "Have little. Search us. Take what is right." Her jaw trembles with the word "please" in a way that makes Edda's hands tighten on her bowl. Marta's plea is not for mercy in the abstract. It is a direct demand to be seen and measured against the law. Thomas speaks up, voice rough. "Barter," he says, "barter before seizure. We can trade tools, wool, any linen." He points at the notice with a knuckle, the paper flapping where the Reeve holds it with 2 fingers. "Let us offer what we have. We need our children to chew." Still his words scrape like a shovel against packed earth. Several villagers nod, others look away. The Reeve shakes his head. The steward's orders are clear. Fines for concealment, inspections. He glances at Edda's doorway and then at the others. His gaze is measuring, not cruel, but a measuring glance can break a person the way a weight snaps a branch. Edda feels her mouth go dry. Suspicion moves through the crowd. Who has hidden food? Who has hoarded? Who will be branded as thief? An accusing neighbor calls, voice sharp from the back of the green. "What of the Thomases? They had barrels last week. Who saw them fill sacks?" The name falls like a stone. Heads turn. The doubt spreads, taut and hungry. Edda's eyes search faces for recognition and find instead the hard line of self-protection. She listens to body language, a man folding his arms, a woman pulling her child tighter, someone tucking a hand into a coat pocket as if to touch a pouch that might not exist. The Reeve consults a list and then reads aloud a set of names to be inspected. When his voice lands on Thomas' surname, Thomas steps forward and says, "Check my house. Break my door if you must. I sold the last handful of barley to a traveling merchant. I had to my wife had a fever. He does not speak to defend himself from shame. He speaks to make the transaction legible. I sold it for coin to pay the healer. I did not hide it to profit. I sold it to feed those near me." Edda watches Thomas' shoulders, the way he won't meet the Reeve's eyes. She feels an emotion tilt from suspicion into something sharper, dread. Dread is a small, moving thing in her hands. It becomes precise when names are read and doors are opened. She had heard a rumor about Thomas' sale in the yard 2 nights ago, but seeing him say it aloud changes the shape of the rumor into a hard fact. People murmur a nervous tide. Sister Agen steps up by the hearth of the longhouse. Her sleeves are folded back. Her knuckles are whiter than the rest of her hands from gripping the edge of a bench. "We cannot stand only to accuse," she says. And her voice is a steady tool, can organize a rota. Forage together, watch rotes. If we share labor and we move quietly, we can keep children fed and make fewer of us targets for seizure. She meets Edda's eyes, and in that look there is both proposal and a plea for leadership. Edda feels a change in herself then. What had been dread and suspicion becomes a resolve sharpened into a plan. She hears how the villagers look at her. She remembers how she counted out portions at the door last week, how she folded her shawl and set 2 spoonfuls of stew into Marta's child's bowl. Action tightens her shoulder-sill. "Go with the foraging party," she says. Her voice is small, but it cuts through the crowd. Thomas' face flickers with surprise and something like relief. A villager mutters, harsh and quickened, "Who will watch your house?" The words are a challenge. "Who will keep you from hiding pouches?" Fingers point. Eyes find the longhouse door. The Reeves men step forward and a hush drops as they approach the first house on the list. Inspection begins. The Reeves officer lifts floorboards, peers into chests. They knock open cupboards, feel between thatch and beam. The inspector at one house produces a tied cloth pouch and holds it up where everyone can see. Fingers point toward Thomas. The crowd leans forward. Breathing stops in the lane as if everyone has been told to hold their breath at once. Thomas is pale. He opens his mouth, then closes it. The Reeves men look at him as if the name on the list had been a test and he had failed. Whispers go through the crowd like wind over dry straw. Edda's hands involuntarily clamp on her bowl. The wood presses into the meat of her palm. A new emotion surfaces, shame plastically shaped into action. Shame coaxes her across the lane. She moves so that she meets Thomas. Before he can answer, "Take it from me," she says, and the words come fast enough to be a small blow. She lifts her chin, feeling the sting of the crowd like cold water thrown in her face. "Found that pouch at my door. It's mine. Take it. I will bear the fine. Leave Thomas." Her fingers feel clumsy. Her voice is steady on the outside. She is asking for punishment. She is offering to protect a neighbor by becoming the target. People gasp. Thomas looks as if someone has put their hand in his chest. "Idda," he says, voice small. "No." Marta's child starts to whimper. A villager says, "Sharp, why would you do that?" Another voice mutters, "She would take a fine for him." Why? The Reeve wants proof. The inspectors press the cloth flat. The inspector's thumb uncurls a coin stub lodged in its fold. The smell of barley and oil rises. The Reeve hesitates the first time he meets Edda's eyes. He measures not mercy but practicality. Someone must take responsibility for a pouch found in a household. Edda's claim places her directly in the path of legal loss. The inspectors exchange a look. One pockets the pouch. Someone from the crowd tumbles forward with a small offering, an extra onion, a stub of salted fish pressed into the Reeve's hand to ease his mood. The reeve's face does not change, but he turns the offering in his palm and then pockets it as if it was simply part of the day. Inside Edda, the emotion shifts again into a quiet, strained relief and a heavier worry. Relief because Thomas is spared the immediate shame and probable fine. Worry because she has just invited the reeve's ledger to open against her. She can hear the village thinking of the price of her courage. A few people nod, some avert their eyes. Sister Agnes touches Edda's shoulder for a fraction of a second, and then withdraws as if the touch itself might be noticed and punished. After the inspectors move on, murmurs revolve around the longhouse. Thomas finds Edda beside the low wall and says, voice near to breaking, "You didn't have to do that. You could have told them it was a mistake." He looks at her, and his eyes are wet with a tiredness she knows well. He sold the barley to hide the fact that I couldn't feed them. I meant to buy bread when the market came back. I thought the merchant would return. He hurried his words as if speed could erase the choice. Edda replies simply, "You the healer needed coin. You did not steal to profit." Her fingers test the rim of her bowl. All make bargains in winter. Some are crueler than others. She does not judge him with a speech. She shows the fact of her action instead. She has taken the pouch. Thomas folds his hands and looks away, ashamed that his sale altered the crowd's suspicion into accusation. Sister Agnes stands and speaks to a small cluster near the hearth. "We form a rota at dawn and dusk. We send pears to the marsh and to the hedgerows. We share the load of making and mending. Edda will lead the first foraging at dusk. Marta, can you teach the others how to boil marsh roots so children will eat?" Marta nods, chin lifted, the child asleep against her shoulder. Her hands are skilled and quick. Her voice is thin but capable when she lists practical steps. A plan appears, not invented from nowhere, but assembled from necessity and the practical skills of the people present. Thomas volunteers a rote. He knows where reeds grow thick. Another man, Jory, offers to carry a net. The reeve's men pack their purses and move to the next house, their boots making soft thumps against the lane. The crowd breaks up into smaller clusters where people exchange short lines of dialogue about routes, times, and what tools to take. Work is discussed like a bargain struck to outwit an immediate enemy. Edda watches the list of volunteers grow. She writes mental notes: who knows the marsh, who can stand watch, who will take a child. She measures the risk of moving at night versus the risk of leaving stores exposed to inspection. The plan requires secrecy, which raises a new tension, concealment to avoid seizure risks, drawing new suspicion. She feels the knot of decision tighten and then loosen as choices are made. Night approaches with a concrete schedule. The foraging group will leave after dusk. Edda, Thomas despite his shame, Jory with his net, Marta's older sister who can spot edible roots, and two others the village nominates. They will use old paths behind the longhouse to reach the marsh where reeds and wild greens persist. The rota for watching houses is set on a slate at the longhouse hearth. Names are chalked and erased and rechalked as people argue over safer times. Sister Agnes takes the youngest child's name and adds it to a list. At midday another event disrupts the fragile rhythm. A messenger arrives from a neighboring village bringing a rumor soldiers moved through 2 days ago, collecting for the steward, and they took even cattle if they found evidence of hoarding. The messenger's breath is sharp and rapid. "They took a whole ox, where they found a hidden bin," he says. The words shift the sense of danger from communal to immediate. Villagers look toward their barns and then at one another. Edda hears this and feels the emotion inside change again. Resolve hardens into urgency. She knows that the cost of being discovered now is not only fines but the loss of animals, the loss of a neighbor's last source of milk. She stands, and her body follows a plan faster than her mind. She speaks to Thomas in quick, clipped sentences about routes and nodes to check who will move at dusk. "You take the western path. Marta, you watch the lane at first light. If soldiers come, hide the children inside the longhouse and ring no bell." They trade small instructions like tools passed in a hand. Dusk arrives. The foraging party steps light-footed along the mud track behind the longhouse. The sky is the color of cooled iron. Edda holds the wooden feeding bowl close. The air smells of wet reed and the distant peat smoke from neighbor chimneys. They move in a line designed to avoid the ruts where the patrol might look for recent traces of foot traffic. Thomas walks near the rear, shoulders curved, avoiding direct eye contact with others as if he could shrink his presence to a smaller weight on the path. They reach the marsh and begin to work with quiet motions, snipping reed tips, digging for fat roots, plucking young greens. Jory sets a net to catch small water birds. Marta kneels and shows a child how to sniff for bitterness to avoid poison. She teaches through demonstration, pressing a cut leaf into the child's palm and pointing to the white sap. The group's hands shape the harvest, fill baskets, check for grit. Their movements are practical and efficient. There is no flourish, only the economy of need. When one of the men probes a soft patch, his dig uncovers a small, packed box of moldy rusk leftover, damp, but salvageable after scraping. He calls softly here. Old bread. Not much, but if we dry it we can crumble it for gruel. It is an unexpected find. The group's mood lifts for a breath. Edda feels hope flicker, then steady, then fold back into responsibility. They have something to bring home. On the way back, they spot a small, informal trap of twine and bone set near the reed bank recently placed. Someone might be using similar routes to gather, or worse, to steal from a hidden stash. The discovery is a twist that changes the group's calculations. Thomas pauses and points. Someone else uses this route. They might be watching for us to come and follow, where we return with baskets. The revelation supplies immediate danger and a new question. Who else in these lanes is active and why? They quicken their pace with a new alertness, moving on small treads, dragging boots through the shallows to erase prints. Edda feels the old mix of fear and practical action, fear that a stranger will follow them back to houses, and a sharpened focus on the steps to prevent tracking. The group returns with the day's gather: reeds, roots, the dried rusk, a few birds. Marta hums under her breath a tune as she binds the baskets, a sound that steadies the others. That evening, as dusk bluish-black turns to near black, the village arranges watches. Edda leaves a single sprig of grain on her windowsill at the last light. The gesture is small and specific, a promise in physical form rather than words. It is not a vow to the world but to herself and to Thomas. She will return what small she can, and she will watch for the coming days. She picks the sprig from the foraging basket, presses it into the old windowsill groove, and then retreats into the longhouse to help cook what they have found. The chapter closes with a concrete beat. Footsteps on the lane outside signal the arrival of two men with bundled cloaks. Messengers come to check the rota and to warn that a second, larger inspection is scheduled at dawn 2 days hence. Edda hears their knock, sets the cooking pot down, and glances at the sprig of grain where it rests on the sill. She moves to the doorway and answers the knock with the calm she has learned under pressure. The plan must shift again. The sprig sits in the dim light, a small, visible promise and a reminder of the choices that will be tested in the morning. Edda stepped into the longhouse courtyard with a small wrapped portion cupped against her chest and found the communal pot nearly empty. The reeve was already there, his boot printing wet mud, and he barked in order to line up for inspection. Shame sat in Edda like a hard stone beneath her ribs, and that shame bent how she moved and how she counted the seams of her shawl. Villagers shifted on the cold flagstones. Marta stood by the pot holding a thin child close. The reeve held a sealed list and read aloud the shortfall in a voice meant to be precise. The central problem was clear: some households must surrender reserves, and every surrender would be seen. Edda had held the last crust in her hand once before that winter. Marta had asked then, "Please share it," and Edda had set the crust down beside the child's palm. The memory of that door, the small fingers closing around bread, pressed into her now. She kept her chin low and kept the wrapped portion pressed to her body. Thomas stepped forward near the notice post and tapped the nailed ration list with his knuckle. Ain folded her hands and watched Edda. The Reeve's eyes moved over faces like a ledger. Shame pushed Edda toward a choice, meant to protect her children and also to avoid being singled out. The Reeve read the shortfall again and snapped, "Bring out any hidden sacks, open every chest." No exceptions. His tone left no room for argument. Thomas answered, "We will show what we have, Reeve. But the tally on the post does not match the storehouse count." Thomas' voice cut through the hush. Ain moved closer to Edda. Marta pulled the child tighter and whispered, "Edda, please." The crowd tightened around the pot. Edda's hands trembled when she slid her fingers over the cloth wrapping. She tested the edge of the last portion with her thumb and felt the dry grit of stale bread. Emotion shifted from shame to suspicion when an older neighbor, soon in grey and blunt-nosed, muttered that he had seen sacks loaded onto the Reeves' cart at dusk. His name was Orin. Orin had a way of naming facts without drama. Thomas came forward and said, "Orin me, he saw more grain than the list allows." The Reeves' face hardened. The villagers exchanged glances. Edda's chest tightened. That suspicion made some heads turn toward the Reeves' cart where a faint lamp blood back into the mist. The Reeve answered with a clipped laugh, "And the sound of paper against wood. The storehouse holds what is listed. Any accusation against me is theft of time." He stepped to the cart and lifted the tarp to show sacks stacked there. The sacks were there, but Thomas walked to the storehouse doorway and counted by touch the weave of the sacks and said, "The ledger says 12. I count 10 in the storehouse, and the cart has 2 Ain. 2 more is not nothing." Marta's breath hitched audibly. Edda kept the wrapped portion at her chest and watched the interaction like a person watching a slow spill. Tension rose when the Reeve ordered households to line up and to hand over any extra stores. People moved in a way that made their own poverty public. Thomas argued loud enough for the Reeve to hear. "Reeve, you asked for a public tally. Here stands proof. The ledger and the storehouse do not agree." The Reeve shot back. "Then bring me proof beyond your counting hands." There were 3 quick exchanges between Thomas and the Reeve, Thomas naming the count, the Reeve accusing Thomas of subtraction for favor, Thomas pressing the tally, and the Reeve insisting on order, and each line pulled villagers closer to either belief or doubt. Edda felt the suspicion settle into her bones and change the shape of what she would do. Marta returned to the edge of the courtyard, carrying a shivering toddler from the neighboring yard, and stepped forward, as if to place the child at the communal pot. "She Reeve, there are children. The smallest need feeding first." The Reeve looked past her rules are rules. Marta's hands shook. Edda watched the child press a tiny face against Marta's shoulder and saw a lip chapped with cold. The sight made a different movement inside Edda. The shame softened into a practical fear. She could not let the child in her household wake hungry at dawn. At the post beneath the nailed ration list, Thomas drew out a smudged ledger page from his pocket and flattened it on the wood. "Look. The entries here show shipments on market day that the post does not account for." Villagers leaned in. "Ain, I remember sacks moved at dusk. I saw it from my doorway." Orin nodded. The Reeve's jaw tightened. He reached for the ledger and Thomas pulled back. A short argument flared, Thomas insisting the ledger be read aloud, the Reeve refusing at first, the crowd calling for transparency. The argument contained quick back and forth lines. "Read it. Thomas Pushidi will read what I choose." The Reeve snapped. "Thomas, you accuse me of stealing for the Lord." The Reeve demanded. Thomas answered, "I accuse only a mismatch in numbers." The crowd's murmur rose and fell like a tide against rock. Edda stepped to the edge of the group and felt the weight of all eyes. She had an inner tally of her own, 2 small bowls, a single spoon, 3 measures of barley soaked last night. She pressed the wrapped portion into her palm until her fingers whitened. Ain whispered, "Edda, don't step forward if you can't spare it." Edda shook her head. She had thought earlier that week to hide a sprig of grain in her shawl. She had felt the seed's small sharp weight and had slid it between layers with practiced motion. Now she counted what would happen if she gave even a portion away. Shame returned, but now suspicion and fear altered her choice. An external event cut across the bargaining when a child started to cry near the pot. The noise amplified the pressure. Marta answered to the cry by stepping nearer and asking anyone with a spare spoon to feed the toddler. Several neighbors produced small bowls. "Thomas, we are not without care. We share when we can." The Reeves' fingers tightened on the sealed list. He demanded who keeps private reserves, who hides food in doorways. The question landed like a request for confession. A private bargaining took place at Edda's narrow doorway. The Reeve leaned close and said, "Open your door, woman." "I must see what you hold," Ain interposed. "Reeve, children must be kept." "Let households keep one portion for the smallest mouths," the Reeve said. "The law gives me authority to verify." Edda's hands moved in small concrete acts. She folded her shawl once, then twice. She rubbed the rim of her wooden bowl as if finding strength in the worn wood. She pulled the cloth tighter over her bundle. Shame again colored her breathing, and then it shifted into a quieter, focused calculation. Edda tested the edge of her wrapped portion with a fingertip and reminded herself what each small measure could do. Her hands moved with practice. She to the Reeve, "There is only what you see on the sill." Her voice was low. The Reeve stepped up and peered into the cottage. His lantern spat a low glow across the wet threshold. Marta stood nearby and touched Edda's sleeve. "Ain, if you search, you will find nothing, but the families need." The Reeve's posture suggested that he did not want to be denied. He raised a hand to order a search. Thomas and a few neighbors tightened their faces and moved nearer. Edda felt a final change in feeling from suspicion toward a hard, quiet defiance. She stepped across the threshold with the wrapped portion in hand and placed the last crust into the Reeve's outstretched palm. The action was preceded, Marta softly. The Reeve's hand closed around the crust. He did not expect her next motion. While the Reeve watched the crust, Edda, with one practiced movement, slipped a tiny sprig of grain from between her shawl layers and tucked it into the fold closest to her children's side. Her fingers were steady. The sprig was small, pale, a single seed head with a thin stem. She had carried it like a promise. The crowd watched the exchange in a hush. The Reeve felt the crust and frowned. He inspected the portion as if seeking signs of hoarding. Thomas stepped forward and said, "We will not have children starved while numbers are moved." At night the Reeve placed his lamp on the threshold and demanded a further search. The moment became a standoff. Several neighbors stepped between the Reeve and Edda. "Ain, no search while we debate the ledger." Thomas laid his palm on the cart's top and said, "We will count again in the open." The Reeve's face showed the first real uncertainty of the night. The unexpected twist came when Oren walked to the cart and lifted a corner of the tarp a half-inch, enough to show the labels on several sacks bearing the mark of the Maina. These were marked with the Reeve's sign, "the week before last," and moved after dusk. The Reeve drew back and muttered that the sacks were accounted for in a different ledger. Thomas countered with a detail. The marketman who delivered these wrote down a different day. The crowd's murmurs turned to calls for Thomas to fetch the marketman's tally. That demand changed the lines of the conflict. What had looked like a collection of private scarcities now bore the possibility of official miscount or worse. Rapid dialogue exchanged among Thomas, the Reeve, and Orin. "Thomas, go fetch the ledger." The Reeve Sadie will fetch the magistrate. If you refuse, fetch your magistrate. Then Thomas shot back, "We will show the counts in the open." Orin says otherwise. Marta pressed them, "Bring Orin forward to swear on the stocks." The Reeve answered. The circular escalation kept the village awake. Edda listened, counting the syllables. Her hands smoothed the shawl over the hidden sprig. The Reeve, constrained by the presence of neighbors and by Thomas' insistence, ordered a recount in the courtyard by dawn. He argued that he would not be accused of theft without proof. Thomas agreed and asked the reeve to wait while he fetched the marketman's Tali from the inn. Marta volunteered to fetch the infant's mother from the neighboring yard. Ain stayed by Edda's side and said, "You did well to give it up." Edda did not answer with words. She watched the dawn pale the sky and felt a small slackening of the fear that had been threaded through her nights. At the courtyard, several neighbors formed an impromptu guard when the reeve stepped back to his cart. Thomas, Orin, and Ain spoke low and fast over the ledger pages. They lined up sacks and compared marks. The reeve's posture shifted from authority to defense. Villagers began to organize a shared pot rotation to make the scant supply go further. Marta found the infant's mother and returned with 2 small spoons. The communal pot was ladled into bowls in slow, careful measures while people counted and named each portion aloud. The act of naming made the distribution concrete and accountable. That night passed toward pre-dawn with the quick events required every few paragraphs. The arrival of the marketman's Tolly, Thomas reading the entries aloud. The reeve's face tightening, Orin swearing he saw the sacks moved, and finally a quiet agreement to count publicly at dawn. Each event altered the stakes. The villagers discovered the marketman's Tali contradicted the reeve's notes on 2 shipment days. The reeve pleaded a clerical error. Thomas replied sharply, "This is not a clerical error. When children wake empty." The exchange hardened the crowd into a shared aim. The climax returned to Edda's threshold in the pre-dawn hush. The reeve reached for the wrapped crust and said, "This will be inspected, and if you hide more, you will suffer a heavy fine." Edda set her jaw and said nothing. She had already placed the sprig into her shawl. Marta reached in and touched Edda's hand. "Edda, Marta, you did right for the child and for your own." Edda's lips tightened. She answered, "I did what kept them breathing until dawn." The reeve looked at the sprig in her shawl when Ain adjusted the cloth to hide it further. He could not prove the small theft of a seed, and he had no appetite to force an entry with neighbors watching. When the dawn broke, the villagers assembled the sacks, the ledgers, and the marketman's Tali on the longhouse benches. Thomas and Orin counted the marks aloud. The reeve's list diverged in 2 places. He tried to explain, a note misread, a shipment delayed. Thomas countered with dates. Voices rose to a level that left no room for evasions. The reeve's authority weakened in public. A small rebellion formed not in shouts, but in the way people refused to be shamed alone anymore. "Thomas, we will not let one list decide which children wake hungry. Count with us." The reeve, unable to show a solid defense, folded his ledger and conceded to a joint recount. After the public count, people organized a shared pot rotation. Neighbors volunteered shifts to tend the common stew. Marta took the early portion for the toddler, and another mother took a later spoon for her boy. Edda sat at a low window with the narrow sprig of grain on the sill. She watched light land on the tiny stalk and counted the days she could stretch that seed into a small planting. She folded her shawl the same way she always did before dawn. The small sprig on the sill was a practical promise she had made to herself and to her children. In the final concrete beat, someone at the courtyard called for a meeting to decide how to keep better records and to watch the cart during the night. "Thomas, we will write our own tally and post it." By morning the reeve swallowed and nodded. Ain placed a hand on Edda's shoulder and said, "We will watch each other's doors now and share when we can." Edda touched the sprig with a fingertip and then slid it into the pocket of her shawl for safe keeping.